Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about RPG 2000. This is a presentation that I was going to give at the 1999 GDC road trip in Austin. Let me give you some context. I was going through my archives, and on the inside the archive of the very first machine I had at Troika, I think I had 3 different machines, I found a PowerPoint called GDC 99 Road Trip. I remember making this PowerPoint vaguely, but I did not go to the GDC 99 Road Trip convention in Austin. Which leads me to believe, because by the way, there were no other notes, no notes on this talk, no notes about the talk, no emails back and forth, that either I made this and never submitted it, or I submitted it or didn't get in. Or maybe even I got in and decided not to go. I have no memory. And what's weird about this is I would have been making this in early summer of 99 as if I wasn't busy enough. We were about a third of the way into the development of Arcanum. Troika had only been around for a year. I was teaching a class at UCI, which I've talked about in another video. I'm like, what was I thinking? Was I not busy enough that I decided, I'm going to make a whole presentation about where I think RPGs are going? I decided, though, I wanted to do the presentation for you guys here because it's kind of a time capsule. I wrote this 25 years ago, almost to the day. And it's what I thought in 1999 RPGs were going to be like in the 21st century. So, without further ado, I'm going to shrink myself down into the corner and show you my presentation, RPG 2000, Design Issues for the Next Millennia. Tim Kane, Troika Games. Okay, let's get started. So, RPGs today. There's 3 things I want to point out about them. First of all, user expectations of what they get in their RPGs are rising. They want longer RPGs. They want more features. They want more agency. Basically, they want more. Meanwhile, the designer of any particular RPG has more design choices than ever. What do you want your game to look like? How do you want it to play? What do you want it to sound like? You just have so many more options now than even 5-10 years ago, where you were pretty much restricted to how it was going to look. And even some of how it was going to play, because there was only certain AI that you could do with the very weak CPUs that were available. So the bottom line is RPGs are a lot more complex today than ever, and I don't see that curve flattening off. I see RPGs getting more and more complex, so that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about all the axes over which they will become more complex. But before I do that, I want to talk about what I mean by an RPG. So yeah, I'm going to define an RPG. First of all, I think an RPG has to let you make your own character. If it gives you a character or forces you to play a particular character, I think that's not an RPG. Furthermore, I think you should have choices that are based on the character you made. So, yes, the player's making the choices, but those choices have to be expressed through the player character they made. And the action success should be based on the character's level, not the player's ability, which is a big difference between an RPG and a shooter, where a shooter gets better when the player gets better, but an RPG should get better when the player character gets better. Also, I want the world to react to the character, meaning the character's actions have consequences. The simulation of the world should react to those consequences, and they should be things that happen to the player and the player knows why it's happening to them. If someone shows up to kill them, like, you killed my brother, I'm here to kill you. Or, you took the magic ring out of the crypt, now all the undead are free to roam around because that ring was the only thing keeping them in the crypt. Things like that. And then finally, I think RPGs should have a story where the character is immersed in it. They don't necessarily have to advance the story, but I believe the story should be driven by the player's actions. So that's my definition of an RPG. So given that, what isn't an RPG? Diablo is not an RPG. Super popular game. I see people calling it an action RPG. Okay, I'll give it that. But it's really not an RPG. The new MMORPGs that are coming up, Ultima Online, EverQuest, I don't really see those as real RPGs either because they don't have a story that's driven by the player. and the world doesn't react as much to what the player does because there's 1,000 people playing on the server. Similarly, adventure games I don't see as RPGs, mainly because you're usually not allowed to make a character for them, but even if you are, they're very limited in what the player's actions are, and the story is usually quite linear. And then finally, there's a lot of games coming out that say they have RPG elements. Once a game tells you it has RPG elements, that's the designer telling you it's not an RPG. Because if it was an RPG, they wouldn't have to say it had RPG elements, because it's an RPG. So, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about what I think the major design issues going forward are going to be in the 21st century. First of all, character creation. I think the biggest thing facing character creation is going to be whether you go class-based or skill-based. A class-based game is one where when the player is making his character, they select predefined classes, and those classes define what abilities the player can do. Class-based designs have an advantage in that it's much easier to design them because you can group together skills that make sense with each other. You can make sure that no class is more powerful than another. It's also easier for the player to learn. Here are the 8, 10, 12 classes I've got, and to play, because a class usually defines the role the player is going to have. This fighter type is going to fight. This magic type is going to throw spells. This priest type is going to heal and maybe turn undead. Class-based games favor group play, whether it's single player but you control a party, or whether it's multiple players and they come up in groups, because classes are usually designed with rock, paper, scissors in mind. So this class is good at this. This class is a good tank. This class is a good damage dealer. This class is a good crowd controller. So you can put those together into good groups. Skill-based games, on the other hand, that's one where the player has real control over what they're making. They pick their skills, their abilities, their perks, whatever you want to call it. It's much more complex for a developer to design a game like that. And it is also much harder for players to learn and play a game like that. I do think it's a lot more rewarding, but you do need to balance this against the complexity. Skill-based games favor solo play because you're making a character that you are saying, I believe this character can survive whatever's thrown at him. You give them enough skills to let them go through whatever adventure that's coming up. Note that most paper RPGs that are coming out now are going towards skill-based games. That's because class-based games have been around a lot longer, so skill-based is the new hotness. I don't necessarily think it's better. I do think it's different, and new games try to be different. So let's go on now and talk about stories and quests in RPGs and the issues facing designers on that. I think stories exist to give the player a reason for just even going into the world and starting to play the game. They kind of give a framework for the player to be in this world. Meanwhile, it's the quests, though, that really dive down deep into the world's lore, into learning about the NPCs, into just rewarding the player. So I see the stories as the breadth and the quests as the depth. I try to arrange my stories in arcs. And what this means is, as you can see on the diagram, there are nodes of the story that must be completed by the player to advance the story. However, how the player gets from one node to the other is completely their choice. And by choice, I mean it's defined in many ways by the abilities they've given their character. So if you play a stealth character, maybe you can sneak from one story node to another. Maybe you need to get into some castle. Maybe you climb the wall. Maybe you pick a lock. Maybe you sneak past the guards. That's one arc. If you're a fighter, maybe you fight your way in. Maybe you just kill everybody and now you're in the castle. If you're a speech character, maybe you talk to people. Maybe you charm them. Maybe you find some way of bribing your way in. All of this will get you from the first node, the beginning of the story, to the second node. You need to be in this castle. But the way you got in is wildly different, which means the context once you're inside is different. For the fighter, you should expect hostilities from anybody inside. For the stealth character, there may be confusion. They don't know how you got here. For the talker, maybe you were told you were louder. Maybe you were given a badge. Maybe you were given something to show people and go, okay, I'm supposed to be here. What I love about that is You're still getting the same story node, but because the context that brought you there is different, the story feels different, even though you're in the same node. Quests, on the other hand, I believe, these are the tasks that the player does to advance the story. They should have preconditions, meaning you can't just throw all the quests at the player at once. Maybe they have preconditions of being in a particular story act, or being on good terms with an NPC, or even having met an NPC, or finding an item, or something. Quests have states. Have you never heard of it? Has it been mentioned, but you never took it? Did you agree to do it? Are you doing it? Did you fail it? Did you succeed? These are all different states that the quest can be in. Quests should be designed so they can be added and removed from the game fairly easily. The ones that advance the story are a little harder to do that, but they can usually be replaced with another quest. This is important because the story will probably be determined very early in the development of the game, but you'll be making the quests as you go along, and depending on your time and budget, you may need to make some adjustments to those. So I like to think of quests as much more malleable than the story. Let's think of play in terms of linear and nonlinear play modes. Pure linear is when the story unfolds in a particular way and the player can't change that. This is very easy for the designer to pace the game, but it feels very trapping and confining to the player. Nothing they do matters. The story always unfolds the same way. Pure nonlinear, on the other hand, is you can go anywhere, do anything, whatever you want. It's very freeing to the player, but it also is somewhat directionless. You're never sure what to do and where to go. What I like is the stories provide the linearity. They have a set of nodes that you have to go through. But the quests themselves are what provides the nonlinearity. How you get from one story node to another, wildly different depending on what quest you pick up, what abilities you use, and how you do it. You can also use world simulation to help assist in the nonlinearity. That's the reaction I was talking about earlier. How people react to you based on what you did is part of the world simulation. So that makes the game itself feel a lot more nonlinear because people will see different reactions in the world as they progress through it. Again, you can think of your world itself as a simulation. The way NPCs react to character elements can be different. By character elements, I mean how they look, what race they are, what items they're using, what armor they're wearing, what actions they've taken, what dialogue choices they've made. These are all character elements that NPCs can respond to. These actions that the player have taken have ramifications in the world. Maybe some people don't like them anymore. Maybe some people attack them on sight now. Puzzles that you have to do either to finish a quest or to advance the story themselves can have multiple solutions. And the world can react depending on how you solved it. When you were trying to solve this puzzle about getting into the castle, did you steal a key? Did you just sneak past? Did you blockpick the door? Did you climb over the wall? Did you kill people? Did you bribe someone? All of these are multiple solutions to that same puzzle, get in this castle. Violence is just one option, and I think too many games use that as the only option. Now let's talk about combat, because I brought up violence. We have to really talk about real-time versus turn-based RPGs. Real-time is exciting, it's immersive, it really gets you into the combat. Turn-based, however, I think provides for a lot more, I say strategy, I think I probably mean tactical decisions. You can have a far more complex game because the player can decide every round what they want to do. As opposed to a real-time game where if you give the player too much they can do, it's really, really hard to play real-time. Turn-based games also allow a bigger separation between the player's ability and the character's ability. When you're playing real-time and you're shooting, it feels like you should be hitting someone if they're in your target. In a turn-based game, you just say, I want to attack this person. It gives you have a 70% chance of hitting. Boom, you hit or miss depending on that percentage. It feels more attuned to your character and not you as the player. What combat style you choose is important to players. Some will only play real-time. Some will only play turn-based. Some are more attracted. They have a preference to one or the other. This will basically help decide what demographics your game is going to have. Now let's talk about AI, which you're going to need. You need AI for a lot of different parts of the game. Combat AI is super important. How the NPCs fight, how they use their abilities, how they take cover, what weapons they decide to use, who in the player's party they decide to attack. These are all things that you're going to have to handle well with your AI. Conversational AI. What skills are useful, how the player can use, how the NPCs react to different things that the player says in dialogue, how quests are handled, basically how the AI of the world, how guards passing by may react to seeing the player doing something. Will the guard react to you picking a lock? Will the guard react to you climbing a wall? These are all things that have to be factored into your AI. Merchants have AI, buying and selling, what their prices are, what inventory they offer you. These can all be part of their AI and interact with the player abilities that the character abilities that the player selected. Skills, like I mentioned, factor into all these. What skills you have to fight with, to talk with, to do quests, to have merchants, healing, repairing items, crafting. These are all things that are part of the general AI of the game. Finally, if you have companions that can group with the player, NPCs, they're going to have their own AI, which is going to be very different than the general world AI, because they're going to not only be fighting for the player and have a completely different AI for deciding who they attack and when, but they may decide to leave the party if the player doesn't act in a way that they like. So that's a completely different AI that you have to make for companions. The expectation that players have for your AI is it will be smart, or at the very minimum, not stupid, meaning it makes choices that the player would have wanted to make for them. They expect AI to be reactive, meaning if you do a certain thing in its presence, they will at least say something about it, if not do something about it. They want the AI to be in some sense predictable, so they can sneak past them. They know how close they can get. They know what might happen when they get caught. They know what may happen when a fight breaks out. Well, that guard with a sword will tend to be doing melee. It's not going to suddenly pull out a gun or a bow. These are predictabilities that players like to have, and it makes them feel more comfortable with your AI. Also, I have a pet theory, which is pets as followers are something that players like a little more because of all the previous stuff. They act the way they think they should act, they're predictable, and they can seem to be smart because their action set tends to be smaller. Now let's talk about the number of players in your game. Multiplayer doesn't necessarily mean MMO. Multiplayer can mean 5 people playing your game. MMOs are hundreds or thousands of people playing your game. I believe that single player tends to promote more of the story elements I was talking about the player advancing the story in a particular direction and the story reacting to them, where multiplayer is more about quests. Quests, because they can be done in lots of different ways, and I said that they kind of deep dive into lore, that tends to be something that groups of players do have more interest in than advancing the storyline for any one of them. Some of the disadvantages of a multiplayer game would be how you handle quests, where maybe one player is on the quest and another player isn't. How you handle monster respawning. If one player has killed a monster in his world and another character hasn't, and then they group up, how does that work? Do monsters respawn after a time? If so, how long is that? How many monsters spawn? Is it depending on the number of players in the group? Or not just their level, but like there's a big difference between 2 5th level characters and 5 5th level characters. You have to think about your AI. Maybe your AI just can't compete with a well strategizing group of players. Then there's ISP problems. People get dropped. Their ping goes really low. There's a number of issues you have to deal with that are completely outside of your control. You have to think about pausing. Pausing is bad in a multiplayer game, including turn-based games, because when one player pauses the game, the rest of them just had their game stopped for no way they can control. So that's why you may want to consider doing turn-based games with a time limit on each turn, so that if a player doesn't decide what to do quickly enough, the game advances anyway. Then you have to think about time commitments. How do people decide they have time to play a game in a group? How do you get people together? How does the lobby work? How do they decide to continue without someone? And then the last one, people can be jerks. People can be hard to work with, play with. It's nothing you can control. So you want to think about how the design of your game controls players who want to grief other players. That could be a whole talk on itself. Now let's talk about camera viewpoint. This is really simple to describe, but hard to figure out what you want to do. First-person cameras, where you look out through the eyes of whoever you're playing, that's great for immersion. You're right, the player's right there in the thick of things. Isometric or third-person cameras, That's great for group play because you can see the play field. It's great for strategy, tactical decisions you have to make. Note, though, however, that some players have a strong preference. And I found that the people who have a strong preference for first person expect it and won't play third person isometric games. So that's a decision you have to make when you're making your game. Let's talk quickly about licenses and genres. The pros and cons of having a licensed game where you're making a D&D game or, say, a Marvel superhero game is the players already know about it and they accept it. They know what they're getting into. So there's a very reduced learning curve. Players know, I'm going to be a superhero. I'm going to be a wizard. They know what to expect. Also, there's a lot of pre-existing scenarios you can use. You know, if you're playing Justice League, who their villains are. This is something that the player knows too, so you already have a good leaping off point. The disadvantages are, of course, very restrictive. You have to work with the licensee, the licensor. There may be restrictions on what you're allowed to do. Maybe you can't ever kill a villain. Maybe you can only bring them into custody. The player expectations can work against you. They want Superman to always be good. They want Batman to be dark and brooding. What if you allow other things? And finally, money involved. It costs money to get a license, or the licensee takes money from what your game makes. So think about that. Now let's talk about genres. There's a lot of non-fantasy RPGs coming out. RPGs are finally leaving the D&D nest, as I call it. And there's a lot more out there you can do than just have spells and dragons. Now, there are some players that resist playing non-fantasy. It's outside their wheelhouse. They don't know how they're supposed to play. They're not comfortable with it. Paper and pencil RPGs, tabletop RPGs, are way ahead of the curve. They've been doing non-fantasy genres for a long time. Computer role-playing games are just now catching up. Finally, let's talk about translation issues. In a big game, you can have over 300,000 words of text, and these all have to be localized into different languages. Put that into context, that's like 6 books. That's a lot of text to be translated. It's a lot of money. Plus, if you're going to do voiceover, that introduces even more time and money, because in different languages, you may have to have different voice translation. And also, once you record someone's voice, that particular text is set in stone, unless you want to pay to bring the voice actor back in. So now that means you can't change that quest. You can't change that part of the story because you've already set it in stone. A few other translation issues, something I call the Holy Trinity, which is violence, sex, and nudity. Violence is difficult because some countries allow violence to be shown. Others allow violence to be described. Others allow the results of violence to be shown. Others not. Basically, this is the difference between can you show blood, can you show decapitation, can you show bone, can you show certain violent acts. Similarly with sex, some countries let you show sex acts, some don't. This gets us into nudity. In some countries, you can have nude characters, and others you can't. These are all things you're going to have to know ahead of time before you even think about translating your game into those languages. What countries even allow some of the content that your game has? So what do I see as the future of RPGs? I think they're going to become way more complicated, not just with features, but with environment simulation, within the kind of AI you have for not just combat, but for dialogue and for reaction from NPCs. And I think we're going to see much more complex, rich storytelling with much richer characters. Basically what I call professional storytelling. Whew. Wow, that was long. Anyway, that was the GDC 99 road trip talk that I never gave. I hope you liked it.